In this video, we'll introduce the chapters of 13 through 17 on meats. In chapter 13, we'll discuss meats in general. Chapter 14 will be on beef, chapter 15 on veal, chapter 16 on lamb, and chapter 17 on pork. All muscle tissue is made up of three main components: water, protein, and fat. 75% of muscle tissue is made up of water. As you cook a hamburger patty, as you cook any type of meat protein, you'll see all the moisture cook out of it and it shrink. That's due to the fact that it's made up of 75% water. 20% of that muscle tissue is made up of actual protein, and 5% of it, on the average, is made up of fat. There's three terms that we talk about when we talk about fat, three different types. Marbling is the good fat that's found throughout the muscle tissues. When it cooks, this fat will melt down, adding both flavor as well as the juiciness, moistness in the steak, or in the meat. Barding is a term used for a technique where you're adding fat on the outside of a muscle. For example, a pork tenderloin tends to be a little bit on the drier side because it's so lean. Wrapping it in bacon adds that fat aspect that'll add the moisture, the juiciness, as well as obviously adding some flavor. Larding then is another term related to incorporating fat into your product. This is a technique where you're actually inserting small strips of fat right directly into the meat. So a large roast, like a top round, that hardly has any fat running throughout it, will tend to dry out as it cooks. So by inserting small strips of fat inside, it will again yield a much juicier and flavorful product. In regards to tenderness and how different cuts become more tender versus tough, you hear that all the time. Really, the tenderness is related to the activity and age of the animal. The older the animal, the tougher the cuts and most of the meat tends to be. But really the activity is what does it. The more a muscle is worked, the tougher it becomes, the stronger it becomes. So if you have parts of an animal such as the legs, the shoulders, the back end, think of a large cow moving around. What parts would be getting used the most? The parts in the center, along the rib, the backbone, they hardly move at all, so they become the most tender cuts of meat. Everywhere else where you have that activity, not only does the meat become tough, but it builds up connective tissue. There are two types of connective tissue found in meats: collagen and elastin. Collagen is white looking. It breaks down when you cook, but it does need a long period of time to cook, and it does need moist heat cookery. So cuts from the shoulder, from the back end again, that are a little bit tougher, with this extra connective tissue here, it'll cook down over a long period of time, become nice and tender. Your pulled pork comes from the pork shoulder. That's a great example there, as well as a pot roast coming from the cow. Elastin is the other type of connective tissue. Elastin is a lot more concerning. It's also been called silver skin as a type of elastin. This is more yellow looking. It's not broken down by cooking. No matter how much you cook it or marinate it, the tenderness won't be there if you do not cut it properly. So we will go through and show some grains naturally on the muscles. When you cut in the opposite direction, you're actually cutting against the grain, and that's what is breaking down that elastin. Another technique might be to actually hit it with the meat mallet, the pointy side. That is poking holes and breaking up these elastin strands. Inspection. We're going to talk about inspection and grading. It is important to know the difference between the two. Inspection is mandated. There is no choice in this. The USDA is saying they must inspect every single meat product to determine that it is wholesome, it is good to eat. They are not determining the quality of it, rather that it is safe for human consumption. Again, inspection is mandatory. Grades then are optional. However, if you don't have a grade marking on your product, it's generally not going to get the same value, market value, and price that you're looking for. So grades, this again is a voluntary process, and you're actually paying for it. But it's determining the quality and putting a label on your product. You can see the label on the bottom left. This is USDA Prime. This is the highest grade of beef. Here you can see the 8 grades of beef. It starts with Prime. Choice would be the next level down. Select, those are pretty much the 3 that you'll find at the grocery store. Standard, a lot of times you will find in more commercial vendors, larger food processing, but once you get into commercial utility, cutter, canner, those are more for canned products, dog foods, dry beef jerky, things that, you know, the quality isn't necessarily a concern for. Then you go into veal. Prime, choice, and good are your top 3. Lamb, the same, prime, choice, and good. And then pork. Here it's giving you the USDA rates them as number 1, number 2, number 3, and utility. Pork is actually not graded. It's pretty much acceptable or unacceptable. These grades then more so refer to the yield grades of how great of a yield, how much product you're going to get out of that hog. So again, having this label on as a USDA Prime steak, you're expecting to get the best quality, but yet you're going to pay the highest price for it. Next, we're going to talk about aging meats. The process of aging meats is to let natural enzymes penetrate the meat, naturally tenderize it, and produce a lot stronger, better flavor. There's 2 ways to do that. The dry aging, this reminds me of old-time movies where there was always someone hanging in the meat locker, if that makes any sense or relates for you. This is where you can see the whole carcass is hanging in a controlled environment, usually with a large fat cap on the outside, starting to grow mold, but again, they're natural enzymes, it's a controlled environment. It really ends up in a really good flavorful and tender meat. Wet aging seems to be more practical. That's where things are cryovac. They're not air reduced packaging. That is, they're again working on its natural enzymes, actually penetrating it and changing that meat. It's a matter of letting it sit in that for a matter of 30, 60 days. Storing meats, it is highly perishable meat products, and definitely a potentially hazardous food product or TCS product. So we should store them in the cooler. Here it's listing 30 to 35 degrees. Definitely in our coolers, we want them under 40 degrees, but we want to make sure they're away from the door so that they maintain an even lower temperature here, such as 35. There are different styles and cuts of meats, and we'll be talking about this in our next video. There are 3 main cuts of meats. When you first take the animal and break that down into about 6 or 8 cuts, those are what's called your primal cuts. These are huge, large cuts that rarely are cooked whole. One example, though, is the steamship round. The hind quarter of the cow is used in a lot of large banquets as a carving station. That was pretty classical, though I haven't seen that in a long time. Subprimal, then, are let's take this whole section and break it down into smaller pieces, like the rib loin, the tenderloin. Those are all coming from the same area or different larger pieces and then cut into smaller. They still generally are not cooked whole, though. The rib loin might be cooked as a prime rib section. Otherwise, it would be broken down into ribeye steaks. Those would be fabricated cuts, individual portions cut from then those subprimal cuts. We'll talk about more of that in the upcoming videos. Also, I wanted you to note of the specifications on the bottom. IMPS refers to the International Meat Purchasing Specifications. These are numbers associated with each and every cut of meat that there is. There's a section of beef, a section of veal, lamb, and pork, as well as poultry items. A rib 109 is a rib loin with a specific standard of how much fat should be on there and a generalized weight. That way you know you're always ordering the same product if it has that notation on it. That is put together and all built into the Meat Buyer's Guide, which is written by NAMP, National Association of meat purveyors.